there's nothing wrong with that conflict of saying like, no, I see it differently, right? And I remember it's really important for a leader to facilitate that. Oftentimes as a bishop, I would say to my counselors, you guys, some of my favorite words is when you say, Bishop, I think I disagree with you. Like, oh, I love that. The leader has to lead out with establishing that cultural norm of like, no, we disagree in here, and that's okay because revelation is spread among us. I think that's Elder Bednar. Conflict would get awkward, but it's actually necessary to reach deeper revelation.
Now is the time for you and for me to prepare for the second coming of our Lord and Savior, Jesus the Christ.
Welcome to True Millennial. My name is Parker Welbeck, and we got here today Kurt Francom.
Hey.
From Leading Saints podcast, right?
Thank you. Yeah. It's good to be here in your studio. This is a cool place.
Kurt was in town, and he said, hey, I want to get together to do a podcast, and so we just filmed an episode for Leading Saints.
That's why Parker's sweating. I grilled him, so it was a tough one.
So go check out his channel, and I'll link it here below for a separate episode. But now I'm turning the tables.
Yeah, all right.
And I want to get a little bit of insight into Kurt's life here. So Kurt, how long have you been doing Leading Saints podcast?
So it started as a hobby blog in 2010, just hit and miss, writing stuff as we blogged back then. And then 2014, I heard more and more things about podcasts. So I thought I could probably do that.
Yeah.
So I, got the USB mic and the free software online to edit, and away I went. And I remember my first episode, I had my nice mic set up, and then by the end I realized it was my laptop mic the whole time. Like,
wasn't even turned on.
Exactly.
Oh, well.
So, you live and learn.
At least it captured the audio.
That's right.
So you've been doing that for almost over a decade now.
Yeah.
And I want to talk a little bit about some of the experiences you've had and things that have stood out as you've interviewed, but you're interviewing essentially saints who are leading. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So give me the idea behind Leading Saints and what the purpose is of the podcast.
Yeah, so if you think about the different resources that are out there, like when you walk into a church bookstore, you can probably find the missionary section, to help that preparing missionary, to have some resources and tools. Yeah. There's maybe if you're a Sunday school teacher, there's something there. If you want to deep dive into specific doctrines, you'll find those sections. But what if you're called to a bishopric, or you're a new Elders Quorum president, Relief Society president, and you're thinking, I don't really know how to motivate people or public speak, or, how do I have tough conversations? Like, what's this thing about, people struggling with pornography? How do I even begin to address that? Right. So I realized there's sort of this gap, and that really just came from my own experience being called as a leader, thinking I want to do a good job, but what's out there? And I wasn't finding anything.
Didn't find resources. Yeah.
So I thought, well, I'm no leadership expert, but maybe I could create a platform to bring the experts, to bring the everyday leaders, because it was always interesting. I think we've all experienced this. We get called to a certain calling, maybe leadership calling. We maybe know a guy in the office who's got the same calling, or a cousin or an uncle, and you reach out to him and say, hey, what are you doing in your ward, right?
Yeah.
And so I've had the opportunity to reach, I think we just passed 800 episodes, half of which are probably these How I Lead segments, where I'll reach out to a bishop in Spain, as long as they can speak English. And we are actually coming out with the Spanish version of the podcast. But, Relief Society president in Australia, and hearing about how is it you lead. And again, these aren't experts, and they're often really nervous. You're interviewing me. What do I say? And it's so interesting. So many say, I've got nothing to share. I'm not doing anything special.
That's how you know that they have something good to share.
Right? 10
Those are the
minutes
types
in,
of people you want to hear from.
10 minutes in, they'll say, and then we did this, activity at the church. We're invited the community for a Halloween party. But then that when I'm like, whoa, time out. What was that? And then I'll dig into it. Yeah. I got to interview the most baptizing ward in all of North America, which is in Southside Chicago, Bishop Pope. And man, some of the little things he does, and for leaders all over the world to hear that. Again, we're not trying to dictate this is the right way to be a leader, a bishop.
Just ideas.
Yeah, this is what this guy doing. And I get so many emails from people saying, man, I listened to that episode and the revelation wheels just turned. We're not going to do it just like that, but I know how we can do it now. Right. And I'm like, oh, that's beautiful, right?
That's awesome. Yeah. And I want to dive into some of the specific people you've interviewed and some of the things you've learned that you can share here. But before I do, I wanted to first get a little bit deeper and a little farther back into why you even started doing this in the first place, because I'm always encouraging my viewers to utilize the tools of social media and to be willing to put yourself out there and share the gospel. But I feel like one of the main ingredients to get you to a place where you even feel the need or desire to share the gospel is there has to be some kind of conversion happening inside you. And so I wanted to go back and ask you, like, what makes you, first of all, stay in the church, but then next level, dedicate full time now to doing a podcast to help other people flourish in their faith.
Yeah. Well, I guess I think this is a story that really all of us can relate to. Is I remember, I often ask people as I have opportunity to speak in different settings, I ask the question, when did God first speak to you? And, everybody's mind is going to take them to a different moment, but usually people can think of some early time in their life where they had this spiritual moment, right? And oftentimes it might be at a youth conference or in those youth developmental years. For me, the first time God spoke to me is as a 5-year-old sitting on the carpet, watching the TV of Christopher Reeve flying around the screen as Superman. And I became obsessed with this character of Superman, even to the point, my mom gave me the homemade Superman cape that I would wear around, would never take off. And as Christopher Reeve flew around on the screen, I'd fly around in my living room. And I was too young for God to reach me through scripture.
Yeah.
But he could reach me through story, through that superhero story. And this message kept coming to me, Kurt, your identity is Superman. You are not from this world. You have a loving Father who sent you here to make a difference, right? And I was telling the story from the stage once, and this guy came up to me after, and he said, when you asked that question, when did God first speak to you? My mind immediately went to this time when I was a 13-year-old boy, and I was in my closet reading the scriptures, and it was just beautiful, like spiritual experience. But then you told your story, and I remembered I cried at the end of Star Wars. And
wow.
And I'm like, exactly. Like there is this part of us that is like aching for influence, for more, to bring people to the glory of God, right? And these stories, the hero with 1,000 faces stories, the hero's journey, we relate to it so much. We're at the point that Hollywood is making billions upon billions of dollars, even though they're kind of getting away from that. That's a whole nother podcast, but nonetheless, like it resonates so much with our soul because our soul is eternal. Like we are not of this world, and we were created by a God whose glory is magnified through what we do. And God makes, we, as it says in Ephesians, like we are God's creation, right? I forget the exact framing of that, but like he doesn't make junk, right?
Yeah.
And so when we have opportunity to have a difference, like his glory is manifest through our acts, and we give all glory to him, right? Because it's his glory. So anyways, that's a long path to this point of like, I've always sort of felt this nudging of like, I want to have a impact for good in the world.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, I went down this lane of, as a kid, I was more artistic, more creative. I never really did well at school, but I always thought maybe I need to be like, go down the path of like my brother with the engineer. I got to get a good job, right? But God was keep egging me down this path of serving a mission. I was never really a formal leader on my mission. I think I was a district leader with a couple companionships, and then I come home from my mission and attend this YSA ward. It's actually where I met my wife, and I was called as elders quorum president. And here we are with. There's like 100+ elders, how these YSA awards are. And I'm thinking, oh man, like I just want to do a good job, right? Yeah. And I admit there's some ego in that, saying like, finally they called somebody who's actually going to try, right? Like none of these lazy who couldn't get anything done. Like, and I remember looking I love this part of my journey of like looking at the report. And the home teaching numbers, home teaching back then, right? It was 39%. And I was like disgusted. Right? Like, I can't believe this.
I'm like double this in a day.
Right. And so I put together the greatest guilt trip lesson, right, in the history of the church. And I give this guilt trip lesson, right? I didn't know what I thought that's how you lead, right? That's kind of all I had seen up to that point. And I remember there was a member of the bishopric in the room, and he got up after and sort of applauded my gusto of really getting after this. And I went to work that month, right? Like overtime in the clerk's office, trying to like orchestrate the perfect companionships. I thought if I could just get the right guy with the right guy and magically it gets done. And just like worked so hard. I didn't know how to delegate. I was, seems like I did all the typical mistakes. And I got to the end of the month, like, okay, we were at 39%. I'm sure we at least doubled that, right? Yeah. Did all the calculation, 38%. Like we had dropped a percentage, right? I was like defeated, right? And I was in that, I met my wife. And so I think I was in that role for like 9 months before we got engaged, married, and moved out. And I really left that experience like I thought that would have gone better. I really tried. They called somebody who was going to really try, and I didn't even move the needle, right? Yeah. But hey, that's behind me. We moved on, and then we were in a condo in South Salt Lake, and I was called into the bishopric for a couple of years, and then that bishop got released. I was called as the high priest group leader, and I thought, oh man, here we go again, right? Like I tried so hard before. Why should I even show up at this point? I mean, I'm not going to have any difference. But then this is when like God guided me to like the local bookstore, and I was like, I love all these like organizational behavior books, and there's so much research, life leadership, business leadership. Yeah. But nobody's talking about this research in the context of church leadership, like how to really motivate people, how to public speak, how to win the hearts and minds of individuals. So that's where kind of began where, well, maybe I can create this platform to have that conversation. And so, and of course, I've always been.
What books did you read?
Oh man, how much time we got?
You going to give us a book list?
And we've got one. If you go to leadingsaints.org/books, those are like my top books. But things like Daniel Pink's book about motivation and a bunch of Stephen Covey books, right? Yeah. And that's the thing. We have a rich history of like professional Latter-day Saints who've had significant influence as thought leaders. And so I just sort of took the secular research and say, now, does this work in a church context, right? And sometimes it did. Sometimes it was a little bit messy, but and so that's where it just sort of branched out from there. And I mean, I'd always, growing up, I've always been, I don't know, some of us, to some it is given to believe, to others it is given to know. Like, I've never, and my heart goes out to those who've been through the dark night of the soul, faith crises, and I have so much empathy for them, and I want to understand that journey, and we've done a lot of content around that. But for whatever reason, I've just believed, and I've felt that influence so much, and the theology we have of covenants and relationship and the grace that we believe in, that to me, as Elder Bednar always talks about, grace is the enabling power of the atonement. Like when I feel God's grace, that he never gives up on me, that no matter how many times I mess up, I can always show up on Sunday, and they've always got the sacrament. Yeah. It's not like they took a week off. And when that deacon brings it to me, he never rolls his eyes and says, really, Kurt, you were here 7 days ago and you need this again? Like that, it's such a beautiful theology, right? And I get that there's some ways to frame it that aren't helpful. And to me, I would just say, it's not that the concept is unhelpful. You're framing it in such an unhelpful way. And so I feel like leadership is culture building. And you hear it a lot, that's not doctrine, it's culture, right? Well, but so who's letting this culture in? Like, where's that coming from? And so I'm not a doctrinal scholar, but I want to be more of a cultural scholar of saying, like, how can we get people to the doctrines? There's an old business phrase saying that, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I believe culture eats doctrine for breakfast. Like if we don't have good culture, you can't get people to the source of light and truth, right? And it breaks my heart seeing so many people who do step away or because of that culture. And so I just want to play in that pond of saying, let's talk about culture. Yeah. What's the causes of culture and how can we have an influence to shift that? So
I think that's a great point. A lot of the experiences I hear of why people are floundering in their faith or have left the church is it usually stems from some kind of bad interaction with a leader. And so I think you bring up an important point that, those leaders, I'm sure every once in a while there's a bad apple, but 99% of them have good intentions and are just trying to do the best like you did as the Elders Quorum president, but you probably rubbed a few people wrong. And, I'm sure we all do that on a daily basis. In my calling, when I'm teaching every other week or whatever, I'm sure there's people who are rolling their eyes at me, oh, this guy again on this rant about that. But so learning those skills of how to be better leaders, having better speaking mannerisms. I mean, I've talked about in our session where you were interviewing me, how refining it's been to share the gospel online. A lot of that is just watching yourself on camera afterwards and going, oh my gosh, do I really look like that? And how often do we analyze ourselves and think, when I speak to my children or to a classroom, what am I like? Am I approachable? The way I speak, is it actually that loving? Like, there's a lot of those small things, I think, is what you're alluding to, that if we would pay attention to and take notice, we could change the culture of the church and really, maybe we feel like a Christ-like person, but is that how we are appearing to others?
Yeah. There's so much there. And you mentioned sort of that the leader is often sort of that tension point of someone's faith journey of like, I was holding on until this bishop said this, or
and he's
I heard
in charge.
this.
And if he's the guy in charge,
Right.
then there's nothing good here.
Yeah. And it's really tough because you think of the scriptures in the New Testament, like if there's one group of people who people felt justified in pushing back against, even the Savior himself pushed back against, it was the Pharisees, the church leaders. And so it's so easy to interpret that, to feel justified of like, I have a Pharisaical leader and I'm not going to stand for this. I'm going to go into their house and tip some tables because that's what Jesus would do, right? When in reality, I mean, that's a whole nother discussion, but sometimes there's this feeling that we don't have to have empathy or patience or love for our church leader because they have all the power.
Right.
When there is a lot that you can take back a lot of power by being loving and saying, this guy, he doesn't understand, or this gal, but I know they're doing it with their best intentions. They didn't apply for this position. And so I'm going to be a little more patient that way, but I know it's messy and hard at times.
Yeah, it is. It's really messy. And it's, I always just go back to because I've had plenty of times where I get frustrated with church leaders and I would do it better if I was in their position. We all think that at times.
Yeah.
But you just always have to go back to, like, they didn't ask for this calling. And it's as much for them as it is for any of us. It's for us to learn patience with them, and it's for them to have some refining moments to become a better leader and a better disciple of Christ themselves. And someday we'll be called upon in some of those positions, and the tables will be reversed. So let's show a little bit of grace.
And I'll share a tactic as far as how people can do this. Oftentimes it's very common in our culture to ask somebody, is there anything I can do for you, Parker? Or Bishop, is there anything I can do for you? Yeah, I'm happy to help you, right? But I would suggest asking this question, saying, Bishop, what keeps you up at night, right? And you hear like what they're struggling with, right? And I remember as a bishop, people ask me that, like, is there anything I can help with? I'm like, I don't know, like, look around.
There's a lot of things.
Like, grab a broom or something, but when somebody took the time to really hear, like, what I was worrying about as the leader, suddenly it's like, oh, I could probably help with that in some way. You know what? I appreciate you sharing that, right? And so you build empathy when you kind of hear the things they worry about, and it really goes a long way.
Yeah, that's a much better question.
Yeah.
So I want to get into just a few of the experiences you've had. I mean, you've been doing this for 10 years now. Tell me some of the people you've interviewed and some of the most impactful things you've learned from interviewing people as far as this topic goes of becoming a better leader.
Yeah, man, there's a lot.
I know you could be here all day.
Yeah, for sure. It's like, which one's my favorite child? I have 800 children. And I would recommend people can go to our homepage, leadingsaints.org, and we always list the top 6, I think actually the top 9 most downloaded, most popular episodes. So that's a good place to start. But for me personally, like, I think years ago, actually, I was a bishop in an inner city ward in South Salt Lake. And so by the time I was done with my term as bishop, I had 7 or 8 counselors. And I remember my last counselor actually went through and lost his faith while he was my counselor, right? And of course, we had a good friendship, good connection, and we talked a lot about things. And there's a moment we were at lunch, and he said, hey, if you ever want to talk about this on your podcast, I'm happy to come on. I'm like, okay, And so we just had this really raw friend-to-friend discussion about where he'd been, and it actually came to the interesting thing about his journey. It was the leadership experience that was the impetus, the catalyst to the last straw of losing his faith, because he felt like, oh, if I'm in this position and I have to speak at every third fast and testimony meeting and share my testimony, if I can't be for certain about these things, then there's a problem. And that sort of spiraled him into this. And with more perspective and people I've talked to, there's a level of scrupulosity or religious OCD that he was probably dealing with, where he just couldn't reconcile any fuzziness in his faith. And that pushed him deeper into sort of a depressed state, to the point he's just like, I'm out. Yeah. And I remember him not showing up at the sacrament meeting where we were all released, was just sort of a moment of reflection, and it just broke my heart that he wasn't there, right? So just these real conversations that were so healing for me, but also helped me articulate to the audience a journey that we may not be realizing is happening behind the scenes. So often in a bishopric meeting, in a ward council, we're talking about others outside the room where we don't really fully understand maybe the wrestle that's happening in the room. Yeah. I think of another interview I did with the stake president, who talked about his journey of struggling with pornography while he was a stake president. Wow. the stigma of that, right? And how he was open with the general authorities that had come and called him. They encouraged him, and on he went. And it really, the shame that he was drowning in as he was trying to overcome that and be the model example stake president. And so often I know there's so many leaders out there who are, in quiet desperation, because they think, if anybody found out what I wrestle with, right? And so again, another moment of sharing, of being a little empathetic to the leader's journey of, there's some things they're struggling with. There's so many that leaders I've seen time and time again who they get released and suddenly a divorce follows, and you're like, whoa, like, isn't that supposed to be a blessing, right? There's so much tension that leaders get to a place
how can
where,
I trust anything you've said for the past 10 years if your own marriage wasn't that good?
Or it isn't the gospel supposed to work and you were doing it the best, but mortality is messy, and that's why we've got to reach out even when we're in that leadership perspective. And not that there's something you did wrong, or if you did it differently, it wouldn't have happened, but it's just so much more messy than we realize, and to have that empathy. So we try and, those are some episodes that come to mind. And then, like I mentioned, just the everyday leader who's like doing something a little bit differently. It doesn't seem like anything profound, but shared on a stage like Leading Saints, where thousands of leaders hear it, and to get the emails of like, wow, like I've listened to that episode 3 times, and I've shared it with my ward council, and now we're doing things differently, right? And we're big proponents of the handbook of, we're not trying to be renegades by any means, but to discover, wow, there's a lot of wiggle room in the handbooks. There's a lot we can do.
Well, there's a lot of gray area that the manuals aren't going to talk about, or a lot of specific applications that it's like, well, how do I apply this general principle to this very specific application? Yeah.
And, going back to our theology, it's just so profound, our theology of priesthood keys. Yeah. The fact that I think of them as literal keys, like God tossed you the keys of jurisdiction in that area and say, take it for a drive, man. See how it goes. But we're sort of like, well, would you just tell me what I do? Yeah. Like, I put it here, now do I push the gas pedal? Like, am I doing it right? Like, just drive, man, And to me, it's beautiful theology that really is unique to our faith tradition of, we believe in restored authority, and that God gives you those keys. So take it for a drive. And we've got historic story after story of times when that didn't go so well, right? But God,
He allows it.
He allows it because you think of the change. Joseph Smith, look at that guy's life. Yeah. The man that he was when he died as a martyr, like, wow, much different than that 14-year-old boy that walked in the Grove, or the Zion camp leader that he was. And so to me, it's like, that's where we have to try some things and realize we have a lot of autonomy, and there's growth in that. But we can't, just sit back and be like, well, the handbook doesn't say we can do that. Doesn't say we can't either, so let's not do it.
Well, I think you bring up a good point, going all the way to the prophetic and apostolic level. Like we're talking more of local leadership mostly, but recognizing and understanding that even Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, the prophets leading the entire church, they're not given a manual on how to do this. Right. they're told to be guided by revelation, and it's going to get messy sometimes. And church history is messy. And if we kind of take that same approach, what you're talking about with, like, if you were to receive a calling as a bishop today, as somebody who maybe doesn't have a ton of experience in the gospel and feels some of that scrupulosity of like, am I cut out for this? Have a little bit of grace for some of these first prophets and apostles who didn't have anything. There was no 200 years worth of church history to learn from mistakes and successes. So of course they were going to make a ton of mistakes in those first test drives. And to not let that shake our testimony because of God allowing the restoration to restore over time and give people, including the prophets, agency and, you know, learn through that over time.
Yeah. And you think that there's so many instances where you think, all right, this guy messed it up. Like, we're done. But no, this is the last dispensation. We've been told this gospel will never be taken from the earth. And look at us in 2025. We're still here. We're thriving. And
Still
there's so
growing.
much more to go.
Yeah. No, I love that point because I think it's a very hot topic to bash on and talk about the mistakes of past church history leaders. And I just think if we had any clue what it would have been like to be in their shoes, we would have a lot more empathy for what they had to go through.
I'm looking forward to those stories in the afterlife. Like, tell me it all. Like, start from the beginning. Here we go. Because it'd probably be a great, streaming series.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are the top things, if you could break down to the audience, what are some of the biggest takeaways, or I guess you could call it patterns you've seen as you've interviewed leaders? What are some of the things you're learning are key to being good leaders?
Yeah, so when it comes to like culture development, which, like I said, is leadership, it's always got to be done on a foundation of relationship. Now, not that this is the tactic, but this is an example. When new bishops reach out to me and they'll say, all right, Kurt, like, what episode should I start with, or what advice do you have for me? I tell them, if I could do bishop again, I would say in the first 90 days, go on a ward couch tour, where your mission is to sit on every couch in every living room in your ward. Because there's something, sure, you've got tithing declaration that comes and goes every year, and they come into the office and you do the thing and they get the treat and they go home, right? But there's something about a leader coming to their home, sitting in their world, noticing pictures on the walls, asking about their job, connecting with the kids. Oh, you got a dog, right? Something shifts, whether it's probably mostly subconsciously. Then they show up to church in the pews and they see that leader up on the stand. They think, he knows me.
Yeah.
And that may be the only formal interaction you do over the years that you serve in that calling, but it goes so much further. And then when it comes time to rally the troops or ask them to do a temple cleaning assignment or to do something hard, they think, yeah, I can help you because I know you, And so that relationship is so crucial. Right now I'm serving as a elders quorum president, and my focus is like, how can we create this quorum as a community first, and then we can talk about the conference talk, right?
Yeah.
And so there's always that time of gather, we every Thursday evening I have just a very informal elders quorum gathering at my house. It's for an hour at 9:00. The kids are in bed. Just stop by for 10 minutes. Some guys will stop by. I can't stay long, and they're there for the whole time, right?
Yeah.
There's something about sitting with other people in their quorum. And they're like, and then they show up on Sunday and like, oh, there's Jerry, there's Bob.
Yeah.
Like, I know those guys. We hung out and laughed and talked about our jobs or our favorite sports team or whatever it is. And so when you build that foundation of community, connection, of relationship, you'll really thrive from that point. And you really begin to understand the problems in the ward, or they're more comfortable coming to you and saying, I'm really struggling, and I've forgotten that text of, hey, can we just go for a walk for a minute?
Yeah.
Right. And especially in a world where we're not supposed to, the elders quorum president and the relief society president is supposed to take on more of a role of that. Like, gone are the days where you set an appointment and go in this oak desk bishop's office and talk about your problems. Like, no, you can call your elders quorum president or your ministering brother and sister and say, I just need someone to talk to. Right. And I often remind people, like, I'll pose the question, like, who's the person you can tell your sins to? They're like, oh, the bishop. Like, yeah, only the bishop, right? No, you can tell anybody you want,
Yeah.
right? As far as repentance, yeah, you may want to loop
Yeah.
him in at some point. But if you're struggling with something, whether it's depression, sin, or mental health, like, you can actually share that with anybody.
Yeah.
I've even had, that episode I did with that stake president who struggled with pornography during his time. I just put the call out. I'm like, if you're a leader out there who's struggling, like, reach out to somebody, even if it's some guy named Kurt who runs a podcast. And guess what? I got a call from a state president in a different state, and he just said, I just need to talk to somebody.
Wow.
And I'm like, all right, man, here's step one, right? And from there it progresses on to other conversations that need to happen. But you gotta have somebody to reach out to.
I think that's amazing advice. And I think on the other flip side of that, because we see a lot of people who the last straw and what causes them to finally say, all right, I'm out, is some kind of bad interaction with a leader, that can go a long way to have that base level relationship, so that when something occurs where they're maybe a little bit offended, they have some kind of relationship to know that, well, he may have sounded offensive, but I know he loves me. And so I'll take it a little bit different way than I would have if I didn't have any connection there.
Yeah. Yeah. That safety, the technical term is psychological safety. We need psychological safety in an elder's quorum. Like, for me, and I know that people disagree with this, but I would have no problem if an elder raised his hand in my quorum and said, I just really struggle with Brigham Young.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Anybody else that's been there? Like, where are we at, right? But we kind of get like, I don't know what to say. Like, just act like you don't struggle and deal with that on your own, not here, right?
If there's anywhere to do it, why wouldn't it be at church?
It should be there. And I get that's really difficult to get to that place, but I think it's really possible.
I think it's hard for a teacher who may not be equipped to know how to handle that.
Yeah, if it's all on the teacher.
Right.
But if we're a quorum, if we're a community that's together, or maybe that it's at the informal elders quorum gathering where a guy brings up some concerns or some struggles, or, like, wow, thanks for bringing that up, right? Not that I know the answer to that, but I'm here for you, man.
Yeah. So. And just having that knowledge that you can confide in people.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's a big, even members who are still active and staying active, there's a lot of assumptions and assigned intentions that happen when there isn't a base level relationship built into these. And so whether it's within family dynamics or, ward and stake dynamics, you just kind of start to assume things and positions about these people that are leading you. And you may be completely off. And if you had just had a conversation with them, you might have all of your misconceptions and preconceived assumptions destroyed in a second. Talk about what can members do who maybe are struggling with a leader that they aren't feeling loved by. What can they do to kind of bridge that gap and build that relationship proactively if it's not happening from the leader? Yeah.
I get emails all the time with this question, but similar ones all over the map when it comes to leadership dynamics. And it's funny, 90% of the time, the answer is the same. Sounds like you need to have a conversation, right? And that's really tough. Yeah. And it's a skill set, to be honest. And there's some great books out there like Crucial Conversations and others where it'll actually give you some really helpful tactics that anybody can do to approach those conversations.
Like what?
Well,
give me one bit from Crucial Conversations.
Well, the one thing is just recognizing that we talked about earlier of and assume the best intentions.
Yeah.
Right. This isn't some evil person that's out to get you or hates the ward or wants to, it's his way or the highway. Like, assume best intentions. Right.
That's simple, but that's huge.
Yeah, it's huge. Absolutely. And it's so, even 2 weeks ago, I made assumptions. I didn't even realize I was making them until I had this conversation. I'm like, I was way off. Okay. All right. I'm going to repent and start over. Right. But I just think of my time as a bishop. If somebody was really frustrated with my leadership style and approach or anything about me, I'd be hurt if I found out later that they never came to me and had a conversation. I know that'd be hard and I probably wouldn't enjoy it, but I would leave that interaction feeling like energy, like, okay, now I am aware of how I am as a leader. I can maybe adjust, or I see where we disagree. Maybe I can explain more why I'm doing that. So when somebody is struggling that way, I would say at least have a conversation. It may be 4 conversations where you're just like, I don't yet feel like you've heard me. And maybe it comes to a point where, if you're on the ward council or whatever, maybe you could just call somebody else. Maybe this isn't jiving, and for whatever reason, I can't, lock in with your vision or whatever. And I would have no problem if someone else needs to step in, right? And those are hard conversations. And then there's people listening to me like, oh, Kurt, if you knew my leader, you would not say it. Like, the narcissism and all the labels we put to it. But I get there's really difficult leaders out there, and it comes to a point that I'll call it the shrink and expand principle, where, maybe you can't show up or be the person you want to be because of the leadership. And so in that realm, you may need to shrink a little bit, but then you can find other ways to expand, right? Where maybe I can show up in Sunday school a little bit differently. I can find others in the ward that are struggling. I can sit by them. I can make 12 loaves of bread and take it to people and say, how are you doing? Like connecting, right? Like these elders quorum gatherings I've done in other wards when I wasn't the elders quorum president.
Yeah.
I was like, my name's Kurt. We're getting together Thursday night.
Right.
Here's my address. Stop by, and I invite non-members. Like a lot of these things I think we mentioned this in our earlier interview of like, if the church doesn't ask me, I guess I can't do it. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
You can do whatever you want in your life. If you want to invite people over. If you want to have a Bible study, a Book of Mormon study, a Doctrine and Covenants study, go, have it.
Right.
And so there's so much you can do that sometimes we get locked into this, he's limiting me from doing what I want to do. Like, all right, shrink there and find somewhere else to expand.
Yeah.
So.
Reallocate that energy.
Yeah.
And I think to do that, you just have to have the Spirit and allow the Spirit to guide and help you understand how to do that. I mean, I know I have my own set of frustrations trying to specifically help the church with their social media. And it's like, okay, I have to kind of fit into the box they have for that. And it might not be exactly how I want to do it, but you shrink a little bit and it's like, okay, but the Spirit's also prompting me to try this. So I can do that on my own outside of the official realm of the church's accounts, And so I think that's a great principle for all members, just to recognize that you don't have to be called to serve in any capacity. I mean, there's certain things that have stewardship and keys, but to be a good neighbor, to love people around you, to serve in any capacity you can. I think there's
a lot of autonomy.
We don't take enough opportunity, I guess, to be proactive in those.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back a little bit to that tough situation between a leader and maybe a disgruntled member, and that tough relationship there that can occur often. Talk to me about the difference between contention and conflict, because we're told by President Nelson, gotta be a peacemaker, contentions of the devil. And I think too often as members of the church, we take that to mean, well, then I can't communicate with somebody something that's a hard, difficult conversation. If it may even have a little bit of criticism in there, or something that I really am not seeing that's okay within this relationship. So we just avoid it and we suppress it and we put it away and we never address it. We never communicate. We never converse.
Yeah.
Because it's deemed as contention. When I would say that it's actually conflict and contention are two different things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the place to start, is that contention's of the devil, but contention is not always conflict.
What's the difference?
Well, conflict is when you have two opposing points of view, right? And to me, that we have such a strong tradition in councils. I mean, if there's no conflict in your councils, you're probably doing something wrong.
Yeah,
right?
There's no real discussion happening.
Yeah, President Eyring mentioned that early on, when he was called, or at some point, there's a clip out there online where he was just shocked at the debate he heard behind the scenes, where by the time we get it, the debate settled and opinions have changed. Right, yeah. And so there's nothing wrong with that conflict of saying like, no, I see it differently, right? Yeah. And I remember it's really important for a leader to facilitate that. Oftentimes as a bishop, I would say to my counselors, you guys, some of my favorite words is when you say, Bishop, I think I disagree with you. Like, oh, I love that. Like, if the more you could say that, the better, right? You. And so often they would do that, right? And so the leader has to lead out with establishing that cultural norm of like, no, we disagree in here, and that's okay, because revelation is spread among us. I think that's Elder Bednar, and we need to get to the root of what you see and understand, and let's get there, right? And unfortunately, it's tricky because it is a skill set. So many leaders kind of think, well, I think it's just better if the bishopric just make the final decision, and because then there's no conflict and it doesn't get awkward, because conflict would get awkward, but it's actually necessary to reach deeper revelation.
So. Well, and there's a reason we're commanded to meet in councils, because at the head of our church is a council of 3 and then a council of 12, and those 15 men, and sometimes it takes years of them deliberating over something, and until all 15 men are on the same page and agree, they're not going to move forward with something. And there's been times where stuff's been held up by 1 or 2 guys where they're like, it's not feeling right yet, and they're okay with that energy of conflict, and they're going to work through it until, what President Nelson says, until it's spine-tingling, when they all come to a unanimous decision through the Spirit. And that has to happen on a ward level. It has to happen in a family level with spouses. If we aren't able, as a wife and husband, to be able to bring up differences in parenting styles, differences in whatever it is that we're maybe having differences on, if we can't learn how to communicate about that and have a counsel until the Spirit can help us come to, it's usually somewhere in the middle. It's almost never always on one side that's right. But together we are able to allow the Spirit to help us know what is the centered truth where Jesus Christ resides.
It's powerful. It's powerful.
Any last words for members or leaders who want to become better leaders or want to have better interactions with leaders?
I would just really invite everybody to be prayerful of how you're showing up in your ward. So often we kind of get in the rigmarole of things of, I did that calling for so long, and now I'm here, I'm teaching this, or doing that, but really step back and say, what if I had the answer to what this ward needs, or who could I talk to? Maybe I'm going to go ask Bishop that question, like, what keeps you up at night? I'd love to know that, and start finding these ways to really step in and serve. And I get it, we live in a busy time, and so maybe you're in a season that you're on the city council and you're focused there, or with the PTA or whatever it is. But we've all been that young boy who wore the Superman cape, and I think there's a superhero mission calling to you, and lean into that. And it might be risky, but that's how God helps us develop.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks for stopping by, St. George. Go check out Leading Saints. We'll link it below. I've only seen a few episodes, but just being here, I'm like, I got to dive into some of those. He brought up a few nuggets where I'm like, I want to get more into that. So go check him out. Doing amazing stuff. Kurt Francom, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.